quite something to think about historical wealth, isn't it?
Yeah.
We all have fixed ideas, but if you go back to the 17th, 18th centuries, well, Bengal was incredibly wealthy.
Absolutely. Part of the Mughal Empire then, covering modern Bangladesh, Bihar, Odisha, just remarkably fertile and productive.
Yeah, teeming with stuff,
Mm.
textiles, amazing quality silk, even saltpeter, which was vital for gunpowder back then, and their exports to Europe. Huge.
It really was an economic powerhouse. The sources we looked at, they paint this picture of just dynamism, a key engine for the Mughals.
Exactly. And that naturally leads us to today's deep dive, the Battle of Plassey, 1757. You shared some great sources, and they really dig into the events, the main players, and why this fight mattered so much.
It's fascinating because on the surface, it looks like a fairly short battle, right?
Right. But history books call it a massive turning point. So our mission today is to unpack why. Why is this relatively small clash seen as so pivotal in the rise of British power in India?
Well, if you look at the context, the British East India Company, it wasn't just a trading company anymore, not really.
Started that way, though, paying a pretty small fee to the Mughal emperor initially.
Yeah, but the sources make it clear their exports just from Bengal were worth way, way more than that fee. That economic interest, that's where the friction starts building with the local rulers, the Nawabs.
Makes sense. The Nawabs saw the company getting all these privileges, and it meant less money for them, less revenue.
Yeah.
So naturally, they pushed back.
And the British response, well, they started thinking maybe they needed a more compliant Nawab, a puppet, essentially, who'd give them the concessions they wanted.
Which brings us to the key people involved. The sources really introduce some characters here.
Definitely. You've got Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab, right before the battle.
Yeah, one source described him as having a ferocious temper and a feeble understanding, which sounds like, well, volatile.
Then there's Robert Clive, the main man for the British East India Company. We'll hear his name a lot.
And crucially, Mir Jafar. He was the commander-in-chief of the Nawab's army. His role, well, turns out to be absolutely critical.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit more. Before Plassey, the British weren't new arrivals. They had a solid presence.
Right. Key bases in places like Madras, Calcutta, Bombay. And they weren't just trading. They were getting involved in local politics, making alliances.
Offering protection to local rulers, often in exchange for, those economic concessions. It was a pattern.
And they weren't alone. The French East India Company was also a major player by the 18th century. Big rivals.
Absolutely. Mirroring the conflicts back in Europe, like the 7 Years' War, it was playing out in India, too.
The Carnatic Wars, those are important here, aren't they? Sort of a precursor?
Exactly. The sources point to them as really setting the stage for the Bengal conflict, a power struggle between Britain and France fought through proxies initially, testing the waters, you could say.
Right, like practice rounds before the main event. Now, before Siraj, his grandfather, Alivardi Khan, was Nawab. He seemed a bit different.
He did. The sources suggest he was quite strict with the European companies, cautious.
But he did let them fortify a bit during the Maratha invasions.
Yes, pragmatic perhaps. He needed some defense, maybe. But he was definitely aware of what happened in the south, those proxy wars. He didn't want that mess in Bengal.
Still, there was underlying tension, wasn't there? Even under Alivardi.
Oh, for sure. The British felt hemmed in, like they couldn't fully use the Farman, that's the royal decree from 1717, giving them trading rights.
And they were doing things that hurt the Nawab's income, like protecting local subjects from the Nawab's taxes, issuing their own duty-free passes.
Yeah, even levying their own duties. Constantly pushing the boundaries, undermining the Nawab's authority and his finances. It was bound to cause trouble.
Then Alivardi Khan dies in April 1756. His grandson, Siraj-ud-Dawla, takes over. Young guy with that temper we mentioned.
And suspicious, the sources say. Very suspicious of how much money the Europeans were making.
So when the British and French started beefing up their forts, anticipating war between themselves.
Siraj ordered them to stop immediately. He hadn't authorized it.
And the British, did they listen?
Not really. They basically ignored him.
Okay, so that's a direct challenge.
It was. Siraj reacted fast, sent troops to Qasim Bazar. The British trading post surrounded it, took officials prisoner. Then he marched on Calcutta.
Calcutta falls in June 1756. And the sources say the British defenses were surprisingly weak.
Almost non-existent, it seems. That a Nawab's larger army took the city pretty quickly after a short siege.
And this leads to the infamous Black Hole incident.
Yeah, a really grim event. The sources describe how a large number of British prisoners, maybe 146, were crammed into this tiny dungeon in Fort William overnight.
Horrific conditions. Only 23 survived till morning.
It became a huge rallying cry for the British. Now, the sources do suggest Siraj himself might not have ordered those conditions or even known how bad it was.
But perception is key, right? It painted him as a tyrant in British eyes and fueled their desire for revenge and, well, restoration of their position.
Definitely. When news reached Madras in August, the response was quick. Send reinforcements. Send Clive.
Colonel Robert Clive and Admiral Charles Watson with the Navy. Their initial goal, according to the sources,
Get the settlements back, secure their trading privileges again, get compensation for losses. Maybe not full-scale war initially, but they were definitely looking for weaknesses in Siraj's support.
So Clive arrives with a decent force, European soldiers, Indian sepoys.
Right, those are the Indian soldiers working for the company. Plus Watson's ships. They sailed up the Hooghly River, met the survivors.
And they retook Calcutta pretty easily, January 1757.
Yeah, sources say minimal resistance. Budge first, then Calcutta itself. So the British are back in control of the city, and the stage is set for the next act.
Which brings us to the conspiracy. This is where it gets really cloak and dagger. Even after they signed a treaty, the Treaty of Alinagar, things are still tense.
Incredibly tense. Siraj was furious. The British had taken the French fort at Chandanagar. He'd actually asked the French for help against the British.
And he was worried about other threats too, right? Not just the British.
Yeah, the sources mentioned potential Afghan attacks from the north, Marathas from the west. He couldn't really focus all his power on the British. It left him vulnerable.
So distrust is high. Siraj starts talking secretly with the French again, moves troops to Plassey. But the real trouble was brewing inside his own court.
Big time. Especially among the wealthy merchants and bankers, the Seths. They were apparently nervous about their money under Siraj, felt safer under his grandfather, Alivardi.
That creates an opening for the British.
Exactly. William Watts, the company man at the Nawab's court, starts feeding Clive information. There's a plot, he says, to overthrow Siraj.
And who's involved?
Key figures. Mir Jafar, the army chief, is the main one. But also Ryder Love, Yar Lutuf Khan, a merchant named Omichund, other army officers too, a whole network.
So Clive sees his chance.
He presents it to his committee. By May 1757, they decide, yes, let's back this coup. A secret deal is made with Mir Jafar.
The deal being,
Mir Jafar gets to be the new Nawab. In return, the British get, well, a lot. Money, land rights. The sources even say the Jagat Seths, the big banking family, promised cash to help make it happen.
the trading company bankrolling a regime change. It's pretty wild.
It is. But there was a complication. Omichund, the merchant who helped broker the deal,
Oh, God, yeah.
he figured out he wasn't getting the cut he expected from the real deal between Mir Jafar and the British, so he threatened to expose the whole thing unless he got paid. A lot, like
Yeah.
3 million rupees.
That could derail everything. How did Clive handle that?
This is quite a story. Clive came up with a plan. 2 treaties.
2?
One real one on white paper without Omichund's massive payment in it, and a fake one on red paper with the payment included just to trick Omichund.
Wow. Did everyone sign both?
Most did. But Admiral Watson apparently refused to sign the fake red treaty, so someone forged his signature. Good
Really?
grief. The level of deception.
It is pretty stunning. But it worked, at least for the moment. It kept Omichund quiet long enough.
So the trap is set. Now we get to the battle itself. June 23rd, 1757, Plassey.
Clive marches his troops there. About 3,100 men, right? A mix of British soldiers, sepoys, artillery.
Facing a much, much larger army, Siraj had maybe 50,000 troops. Lots of cannons, even some French artillery support. Numerically, it looks like no contest.
But the numbers don't tell the whole story because of the conspiracy.
Not at all. Large parts of the Nawab's army, commanded by Mir Jafar, Ryder Love, Yar Lutuf Khan, they were there, but they just didn't fight. They stood down just as planned.
So the battle starts around 8 a.m. French cannons open fire first.
Yes, the British take cover in a mango grove. Then, a key moment early on. One of Siraj's loyal generals, Mir Madan Khan, is killed.
It must have hit morale hard.
Seems like it really shook Siraj. Sources say he actually went to Mir Jafar, pleaded with him to defend him.
And Mir Jafar, having already switched sides.
He basically told Clive what happened and suggested Clive should advance. Gave Siraj some vague assurances, probably.
Then Raidullah advises Siraj to pull back and leave the battle to his generals.
Yeah, and tells him to head back to the capital, Murshidabad. A terrible decision, really. The Nawab leaving the field, it just crushed the morale of the loyal troops who were fighting.
While all this is happening, one of Clive's officers, Major Kilpatrick, attacks without orders.
Apparently so. While Clive was resting, Clive wasn't happy about the lack of orders, but he saw the opportunity and pushed the advance forward himself.
And as they advance, they see this big chunk of the Nawab's army just sitting there.
Right. Clive worries they might be aiming for his supplies, but then realizes, that's Mir Jafar's division, doing nothing, just as agreed.
So the British press their attack. 3 directions.
Yep. And by late afternoon, around 5 p.m., it's basically over. They've taken the Nawab's camp, his defenses.
And the casualties.
Remarkably low for the British. Sources say about 22 killed, 50 wounded. The Nawab's side lost maybe 500. After about 11 hours of fighting, or rather maneuvering and some fighting.
So the battle is won. What happens immediately after?
Clive meets Mir Jafar, hails him as the new Nawab of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, tells him to get to Murshidabad and secure the capital.
And Siraj-ud-Dawla.
He fled, tried to escape in disguise, but he was caught pretty quickly, and then tragically murdered by Mir Jafar's own son, according to the sources.
Grim stuff. And the treaty with the new Nawab, Mir Jafar.
Very good for the British, as you'd expect. Lots of land granted to the company, all their old privileges confirmed and expanded, plus a huge sum promised as compensation.
But there was a slight hitch with the money.
Yeah, it turned out Siraj's treasury wasn't quite as full as they'd calculated. They didn't get the full amount immediately.
And Omachand, the merchant who got tricked with the fake treaty.
Oh, right. When he found out, he'd been completely deceived and would get nothing. Well, the sources say he basically lost his mind. A pretty sorry end. Politically, this changes everything in Bengal. The French are effectively finished there as a rival power.
The British later defeat the Dutch too, right? At Chinsura.
Yes. In 1759, they consolidated their power. They even ended up deposing Mir Jafar later and putting Mir Qasim in his place for a while. The East India Company was now the top European dog in Bengal.
It's undeniable looking at the sources. Plassey was the turning point. It gave the company immense wealth, massive political clout.
It really did. It funded further expansion, enabled them to project power across India. It's the launchpad in many ways.
And Clive got his reward. Baron Clive of Plassey.
Indeed. The victory really paved the way for the British Raj, laid the foundations.
But there's another huge consequence we need to talk about. The economics, this drain of wealth idea.
Yes, this is crucial. Before Plassey, if the British or other Europeans wanted Indian goods, textiles, silk, whatever they generally had to pay for it, with imported bullion, gold and silver coming into India.
Okay, so let's unpack that shift. What changed after Plassey?
Fundamentally, the British now controlled the revenue of Bengal. They didn't need to bring silver from Europe anymore. They could use the taxes and other income collected within Bengal to buy the goods they wanted to export back to Britain.
So the money generated in Bengal was used to buy Bengali goods, which were then shipped away.
Exactly. The flow of wealth reversed. Bullion stopped coming in, and Bengal's own surplus revenue started flowing out, financing British trade. This is the core of what nationalist economists later called the plunder or the drain.
And we're talking significant amounts.
Oh, yes. Sources give various estimates, but figures like nearly £5 million sterling leaving India in just the first few years after Plassey are mentioned. And over the longer term, by the late 19th century, estimates run into billions.
This drain of wealth theory, it became really important for Indian nationalists, didn't it?
Hugely important. Thinkers like Dadabhai Naoroji used it to explain why India seemed to be getting poorer under British rule. His argument was simple. This constant transfer of wealth to Britain, with no real economic return for India, was bleeding the country dry.
And Naoroji identified specific ways this drain happened.
He did. Things like salaries and savings sent home by British officials, profits of British merchants, payments for goods bought by the Indian government in Britain, interest on debts held in Britain, what he called the home charges for administration and military costs.
So his argument was that colonialism itself was the cause of poverty, not internal factors.
Precisely. He laid out these factors. Being ruled by foreigners whose interests weren't India's, paying for that foreign administration and army, free trade policies that favored Britain, and the fact that foreigners earned wealth in India but took it out of the country.
It's a powerful argument. The idea that this drained wealth, if kept and invested in India, could have dramatically boosted the economy.
Exactly. While historians might debate the precise figures, maybe some early estimates were a bit high, Naoroji's core point about a significant unrequited transfer of wealth is widely seen as a valid critique of the economic impact of colonialism. It definitely hampered India's development.
So, wrapping this up, Plassey, Seems like the key takeaway is that this short battle, relatively low casualties for the winners, was just disproportionately significant.
Absolutely. The conspiracy, the betrayal, the way the company leveraged it to gain political control and then economic dominance, it fundamentally altered India's path.
You can really trace a line from that battle to the consolidation of British power and the beginning of that long period of economic extraction we just discussed.
And the sheer audacity of it all. A
Yeah.
trading company essentially orchestrating a coup, deceiving allies, taking over a massively wealthy region. It's quite the story.
And that shift from bringing money in to pay for goods to just taking the region's revenue to buy those goods, that speaks volumes about the power shift.
It really does. A stark illustration.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it, how things might have gone differently if Siraj had won at Plassey.
Hmm.
What does it teach us about, well, the long shadow cast when money and political power get tangled up like that?
Good questions. There might be a monument on the battlefield today, but the real legacy of Plassey, its echoes, you can still feel them in Indian history and its place in the world. It's something to really think about.